and welcome to the Atlanta History Center's virtual author talk featuring Towne O'Neill for discussion of Down Along with That Devil's Bone, a reckoning with monuments, memory, and the legacy of white supremacy. He will be in conversation tonight with Anthony Knight. I'm Kate Whitman, Vice President of Author Programs and Community Engagement for the History Center, and I'm glad you're joining us this evening. You can purchase copies of Down Along with That Devil's Bone at the link in the chat to the right of your screen from our official bookselling partner, Acapella Books. It's also at the link provided at the History Center's website. As Connor and Anthony are talking, please submit your questions via the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Anthony will get to as many of them as time allows. Please remember to put them in the Q&A and not the chat. And now to introduce our speakers. Towne O'Neill's writing has appeared in New York Magazine, Vulture, Slate, RBMA, and The Village Voice. He works as a producer on the NPR podcast White Lies. Originally from Lancaster, Pennsylvania, he lives in Auburn, Alabama, where he teaches at Auburn University and with the Alabama Prison Arts and Education Project. This is his first book. Anthony Knight is the founder, president, and CEO of the Baton Foundation, a nonprofit organization that serves the emotional, intellectual, and cultural needs of Black boys ages 10 to 17. Before founding the foundation, Mr. Knight worked for 22 years as a museum educator and consultant. Mr. Knight has extensive experience with an interest in African American history and culture, public and living history, informal education, and Black youth. And that's actually how I got to know Anthony, because we worked together at the Atlanta History Center a million years ago, it feels like. Thank you both so much for being here. And Anthony, I will turn it over to you now.
Thank you so much, Kate, and thank you, Connor, for joining us this evening. I'm really excited to hear more about your book and the conversation that I'm sure we're going to enjoy from the questions that come in from the audience. And welcome to all of you who are joining us this evening. Although I can't see you, I know you're there, and thank you for making time for this amazing program and for spending some of your evening with us here at the Atlanta History Center. So Connor, I know we chatted a little bit, and I believe you would like to begin this evening by kind of setting a tone and doing that by reading just a snippet from your book. So if you want to do that and get us started, that'd be great.
Cool, I will. Thanks, Anthony. It's good to be with you. I'm looking forward to this too. So this book, it takes place, it's in 4 sections, 4 different cities, 4 different monuments of Nathan Bedford Forrest, and 4 different battles over whether or not they should, whether or not they would stay up. So I'll just read a little bit from the first section that takes place in Selma, Alabama, which is where I first encountered this story, and then we'll go from there. All right, so here we go. There's a story about Nathan Bedford Forrest from late in the war that I've come to think of as a parable for his life and for his memory. It's September 10th, 1864, just months before the Battle of Selma. The scene, a train depot near the Mississippi-Alabama border. Forrest is deep in thought, planning a raid. It's been almost a year since Lincoln, in his Gettysburg Address, recast the war as a fight to refound the Republic, and just days since Union General Sherman took Atlanta. Forrest's attempts to cut off Sherman's supply lines have proved futile. Soon, Sherman will march to the sea. The Confederate rebellion to perpetuate and expand slavery is a cause increasingly lost. Forrest had enlisted in that rebellion as a private, but by now he's a major general. He'll be promoted once more before the war's end to lieutenant general. Unlike many of the other commanders, Union and Confederate, Forrest had never been to West Point, had barely attended school at all. "I never see a pen but what I think of a snake," he has famously said. So while other commanders might see to correspondence, read, or consult with advisors, the cagey, solitary Forrest walks himself into a trance to clarify his thinking. He tucks his hands behind his back, he mutters to himself. His steps inscribe a circle around the squat brick station. A soldier in Forrest cavalry spots him and approaches with grievances to air. Without breaking stride, without winding up, without hardly even looking up, Forrest knocks the soldier unconscious with a single blow. Another of Forrest's cavalrymen looks on and describes what happens next in his journal. After the blow, Forrest keeps walking as if nothing has happened. The soldier writes, calmly and unconsciously stepping over the prostrate body each time he came around again. Each time he came around again. His monuments have a way of doing that too. I've often thought of this story while reporting in Selma, and never more frequently than when I was trying to reach the Reverend James Perkins Jr. But Reverend Perkins didn't want to talk to me about Forrest statues, at least not at first, which is understandable. You're elected as the first Black mayor in Selma, the city synonymous with Black voting rights. And less than a week after your inauguration, a group puts up a Confederate statue. And not just any statue, but one of Nathan Bedford Forrest. Then that statue is stolen, and just after another one goes up in its place, the whole country is engulfed in a debate about Confederate monuments. And some white journalist with a Pennsylvania number starts calling you. He was skeptical. My calls went to voicemail. But I figured his sense of what was at stake in these debates would be crucial, so I kept calling. I left my card in his mailbox. I spoke with his niece, and eventually Reverend Perkins called me back and heard me out. I told him I was using Forrest monuments as a lens to look at race, memory, and the legacy of the war. And in doing so, I was coming to some hard truths about my country and myself. He sighed and agreed to meet for an interview. That statue, he told me before we got off the phone, was a pronouncement of war.
Wow, that's quite powerful. Thank you, Connor, for sharing that. Something stuck out to me while you were reading. You say that you kept calling and you were persistent. And so maybe you could start off by helping us understand a little bit about who you are and what inspired you to want to write this kind of book.
Yeah, absolutely. So I grew up in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, which is, pretty close to Gettysburg. The southern border of that county is the Mason-Dixon line. But growing up, the received wisdom was sort of like, we're on the right side of history. We were affiliated with the Union Army. Like, we're good. This is let the past be the past. We weren't encouraged to think much about how this history might still be with us. And similarly, that was sort of the received wisdom about race too. Insofar as race is still a problem in this country, it's a problem about people's hearts, and mostly it's a problem down there. I didn't think much about the Civil War really until I moved to Alabama. I moved to Tuscaloosa to attend graduate school. And I was here in Tuscaloosa during a lot of the 50th anniversaries of civil rights movement moments. I started at the University of Alabama at the 50th anniversary of the George Wallace's infamous stand in the schoolhouse door to try and resist the integration of that school. A couple weeks later was the 50th anniversary of the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham that killed 4 little girls. And so I was starting to try and make sense of Tuscaloosa and make sense of living in the South by looking at the civil rights movement. And so that's what leads me to be in Selma, Alabama on the 50th anniversary of Bloody Sunday. That's the attack by Alabama police officers on civil rights demonstrators at the foot of the Edmund Pettus Bridge there in Selma, the late John Lewis among them. And 50 years later, President Obama's there to give a speech, and 40,000 other people showed up. And Selma, as y'all might know, is a pretty small city. So 40,000 people is, enough to make it feel sort of, packed to the gills. And so I show up. I'm a broke graduate student. I'm trying to find some free parking. And I think, oh, I know there's a cemetery that's, within walking distance of downtown. And it's one of these, sort of cliched Southern cemeteries, mausoleums, Spanish moss, its own system of roads. And so I think I'll stash my car in there. I'll walk down to the bridge. I will nod in, somber acknowledgement of, this history, and think of, and it's convenient to think about that moment, especially for a good white liberal Northerner, it's tempting to think about that day and that anniversary in terms of progress, right? The bridge, this symbol of crossing over, that we've transcended this history. The first Black president is there. That very much characterized how I was thinking about the history. I was interested in the movement. I was there to report on it, but I had some pretty sort of naive post-racial ideas about what that history meant. And so there I am pulling into the cemetery, and I start seeing these signs that say Confederate Memorial Circle closed, no trespassing. And, that's kind of catnip for a reporter. So I walk over and these couple of folks that are out working in this Confederate section of the cemetery come out to meet me, and kind of credulously, I just say, like, what are y'all doing here? What's going on? And come to learn that this group, who calls themselves the Friends of Forest, had spent really the better part of 2 decades, the last 2 decades, fighting about this statue of Nathan Bedford Forrest that they had put up. And they had done it originally back in 2000, as in the reading, just after the town had elected its first Black mayor. Incredibly controversial. This Forrest, though people admire him as being a sort of military genius, he was also a slave trader. He's an accused war criminal, the first Grand Wizard of the Klan, operated a convict leasing system in the last years of his life. Infamous, probably the most infamous figure from the war. And so they'd spent all this time fighting about this statue. That statue was eventually stolen. Then that only made it more controversial, more protests, more debates, a federal lawsuit even. And by the time that I met them in 2015, they had won that federal lawsuit and were about to replace this statue. And so the dissonance of that day, thinking about that day just in terms of progress and in terms of, sacrifice and the bravery of the civil rights movement, and then meeting these neo-Confederates, it just gave me whiplash and raised all of these questions about who Forrest was and what it meant to put up a monument to him in 2015. And so those are sort of the questions I've been chasing ever since.
Wow, that's a monument in 2015. That's something else. One going up.
Yeah.
So the title is Down Along with That Devil's Bones, a reckoning with monuments, memory, and the legacy of white supremacy. But the title, Down Along with That Devil's Bones, where did that come from? It's almost a little convoluted. In a way.
It's a long title. It's a long title. And there's actually a long story that goes along with it.
Well, give us the short version, if you might.
All right. Here's the elevator pitch for the title. So like I said, this book, it takes place in 4 different cities. It covers 4 different monuments and follows campaigns trying to remove them in the last couple of years. And so that, of course, meant a lot of driving time, a lot of reporting and a lot of driving. And if you're like me, you spend enough time in the car looking out the windshield, especially if it's late at night, you can kind of go into an almost like fugue state, and you start making connections and have, thinking and associative sort of out there thoughts. And it was on one of those drives coming home from a reporting trip that a couple of different ideas from the research kind of clanged into each other and resulted in this title. And the first part of that is That Devil. And that was General Sherman's name that he gave to Forrest, that devil Forrest, as he was calling for Forrest to be stopped by any means necessary, even if it meant bankrupting the Treasury in pursuit of him. And that moniker sort of stuck to Forrest. And the other part comes from Murfreesboro, which is a small city in Tennessee that I had done some reporting in. It's where Middle Tennessee State University is, a university that has a long association of using symbols of forest, and had a really interesting debate that I reported on in the present, but also, have been fighting about it since the school integrated 50 years ago. And I had dug up an old letter to the editor from the school paper during a debate about Forrest back in the 1960s, and the writer said, we should have the good sense to let Forrest's memory stay buried along with his bones. And I just love that image. And so that's swirling around in my head, that devil is swirling around in my head. And, it's 2 a.m. on I-65, and all of a sudden, Down Along with That Devil's Bones pops into my head. And, it's a bit of a nonsense title. But I like long titles generally, obviously. And I think it has a nice rhythm to it. But yeah, it's a long story for a long title.
So you're a journalist.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk to us a little bit about the process that you went through to write the book, and how it impacted you as a journalist, writing about something that, sadly now we're having to witness firsthand. But of course you wouldn't have known that in 2015.
Yeah. But I did have the sense back in 2015 that this debate had really touched a nerve in the country, and really was getting at a central tension of the country. That statue in Selma that we've been talking about, like I said, they had won that lawsuit, and when I met them, they were getting ready to replace the statue. That statue went up at the end of May in 2015, and so it's just a couple weeks later that Dylann Roof prays with and then murders 9 parishioners at Mother Emanuel AME in Charleston. And it became clear after he was apprehended, and images from his blog start to circulate, that he had gone on this sightseeing tour, this strange sightseeing tour from slave memorials and Confederate monuments and Civil War sites throughout the state to kind of steel himself for what he was going to do at Mother Emanuel, this act of terrorism. And so that touches off the sort of first wave of monument protests that summer. So I decide, because I had this strange encounter with Forrest, I would report on some of these campaigns aimed at Forrest specifically. And it was at first I thought, I will come at this as a reporter. I really did sort of think of myself as an outsider, that I wasn't aware that I had a stake in this too, or I was naive about the stake that I had in this too. Like I said, I'm from the North. This is a Southern problem. I can be that sort of objective. You can't really say that word without scare quotes around it. But I could observe. I could do a sort of third person, document these protests. But the more that I followed them, and the more that I dug into not just the history of the Civil War, but the long legacy after the Civil War, the sort of cold Civil War, as it's come to be called, of fights in classrooms, courtrooms, bank offices, to continue to keep the country built along lines that benefit white Americans and to the exclusion of Black Americans. I really came to see, I've been telling myself a lot of convenient stories about what it means to be white, what it means to be a Northerner, thinking that I could somehow absent myself from this history, but coming to see all of the different ways that race had shaped my life. And so it really, the reporting of it really did prompt a much more personal reckoning. And it was in encounters like trying to get Reverend Perkins to, I read that bit from, trying to get someone like him to talk to me. It was clear that he wasn't going to talk to me about what it meant for him that statue of Forrest went up in his first week in office, until I could kind of talk to him about what it meant for me that statue went up. That I think he wanted to see that I wasn't just going to report on the spectacle of that happening, but to know that I had a stake in this too, and these ideas about race and power implicated me too. And I got the sense that he wasn't going to waste his breath talking to me unless I knew I had a sense of the consequence of this story, not just the events of the story that I could report on, but a deeper wrestling with the consequence of what that story meant. So the reporting process prompted a much more personal reorientation to the story. And so I think the book, is a work of journalism. There's a ton of reporting in it. There are a ton of people that I talk to, really dedicated organizers trying to get these statues down, recalcitrant neo-Confederates fighting to keep them up. But of course, all of the trying to place the fights in the present in the context of the history that these monuments seek to commemorate, and the stories that these monuments don't want to tell as well. But the process of doing all of that pulled me in closer, and I knew that I didn't feel like I could do this story justice unless I was more self-reflexive and understanding the ways that this story was shaping me, and how the ideals that the Confederacy held, the ideals that the country holds, so many policies that are still in place are all meant to benefit me, and you can look back to the legacy of slavery to account for a lot of that. So yeah, it's reporting, but then it's trying to reckon with the meaning of those stories that I was reporting on too, for the people involved, but also for me.
Thank you for sharing that. We have a couple of questions in the Q&A, but I want to hold off for just a little bit. I have two more questions I'd like to ask you to give your thoughts to. One is kind of based on what you were just saying. You are, at least in my opinion, you are fortunate that you had a process that allowed you to come to a personal exploration of self. What about those whites who considered themselves liberal and wanting to do the right thing and all the rest, who may not have a process like you had? And even those who might be on the fence, how do we help them not just, as you say, look out and how do I help them deal with it, but what does this problem mean for me as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it, you're right. Like it was this incredible opportunity to spend a lot of time reading up on and talking to really smart people about this history and the consequence of this history. And I think the big turning point for me was understanding that, yes, the war led to the end of slavery and the emancipation of the enslaved. But crucially, and why it feels like we're still fighting this war, is because of the lies that Americans were telling themselves to justify that system. The system of slavery, physical, spiritual torture, a massive project of extracting wealth from that labor that enriched the North just as much as it enriched the South. That was, I mean, just horrific, a morally bankrupt project, and and everyone knew it. So to justify it, I mean, even maybe just subconsciously, but to justify it, Americans for a long time leading up to the war had been telling themselves this lie about white supremacy and Black inferiority. And again, the opportunity afforded by this book is that I can go and I can look at the articles of secession of these different states. I can look at the speeches that Confederate President Jefferson Davis is giving, Confederate Vice President Alexander H. Stephens is giving. They were, in the lead up to the war, they were telling anyone who would listen, the project of the Confederacy is the project of perpetuating slavery and expanding it west with the frontier. And we are justifying it. I mean, the cornerstone, as Alexander H. Stephens said, is this idea of Black inferiority, the sort of slavery as a natural state almost. And Davis saying, made famous by Ibram Kendi, but stamped from the beginning, stamped by their creator with this inferiority. And so what you see then is that the war might lead to, one of the consequences of the war might be the emancipation of the enslaved, but the surrender at Appomattox was not enough to dig up that deeper lie, a lie that was a very American lie, not just a Confederate lie. And so that lie of white supremacy and and Black inferiority would be replicated through policies long after the end of the Civil War. And so I think that was really important for me. And you know, I think I know it might be strange to say this, having devoted all this time to one person, one figure from this war. But one of the big things that I learned in working on this was, like, there are policies and there are outcomes from those policies based on this lie of white supremacy, that lead to these unequal outcomes that are made to benefit me, and people who look like me. That, you know, maybe, Forrest surely fought for and worked to uphold, but, you know, we can look at the outcomes in the present to understand the consequences of this history too. We're still living with the consequences of this system of slavery and the lies we were telling to justify it, whether that's the racial wealth gap, whether that's disparate deaths from the coronavirus. I mean, it's seeped into every part of our society. So yeah, I mean, I think it's trying to square up to that deeper lie, that was told to justify slavery, and tracing its consequences into the present. That's hard to do. I mean, we want our history to flatter us, right? We want to have a good history. We want to have a happy history. I mean, especially, the received wisdom of America being the greatest country in the world and having these ideals of freedom and equality and justice. It can be really hard for people who grow up just swimming in that to think, oh, our history actually asks something of us too, and we might hold us responsible for things too. So yeah, I think if we can square up to this history from the war and look at it not so that it can flatter us, but that it can hold us accountable too, I think is the big takeaway, I hope.
So I have one other question I'd like to ask, and we have some questions in the Q&A that we should get to. Talk to us about your thoughts regarding what's happening in our society today with the monuments that have been torn down, and the environment that's propelling that activity.
Yeah, I found the images of these monument topplings to be incredibly powerful. And I think in some ways people are done asking. Looking at the campaigns from 2015 and in the years since, a lot of the stories that I reported on, people were trying to sort of proceed as the way allows. Appeal to the better angels of city councils or state legislatures, mayors, university administrations, whatever it might be, trying to sort of play ball with the, and follow the bureaucratic structures to get these statues taken down. And in a lot of cases, they were rejected. They were turned away. And so one of the powerful things for me about watching this summer is that people are done asking. They're coming down. People know what they mean. The plausible deniability of heritage, not hate, it holds no water. It's kind of incredible that it ever held any water. But people are this sort of uprising, this organic expression of the people, I think has been really powerful. And it's a good reminder that movements, especially freedom movements, take so much time, so much organizing, so much commitment, that I think we're seeing now the payoff of years of work, people sensitizing us to see these statues that maybe some of us had gone blind to or hadn't thought much about, or thought about the deeper wrong that was there. We have been sensitized to them now, and now it's just become too much to bear almost. And so I found some real power in those topplings. And what's been nice too is seeing not just Confederate monuments under target, but the deeper history of colonialism, whether that's Christopher Columbus or other figures in the Southwest. There's a real referendum on our history now that these public monuments are sort of exponents of, and I think that's been really important. Some people have been asked sometimes since this book has been out about the slippery slope. What about the founding fathers? What about Washington? What about Jefferson? I think it's great, like, because these aren't perfect people. And again, getting over this naive sense of our history, but understanding them as deeply flawed people that maybe we don't want to honor in public in the ways that we have. Maybe we do need to come to a more complicated understanding of who they were and be able to hold critiques of them in our heads too. Especially as, yeah. So I think that's been, I welcome that too. I welcome that debate. We'll slide down the slope as long as it takes to get a more honest understanding of the, our country's history.
Well, and maybe even to refine our thinking about what we value. Because, as you say, with Washington and Jefferson, certainly they, like we all are, complicated people, but maybe that's not the conversation we should be having. Maybe the conversation is, what do we really want to value as a country? What kinds of individuals, not just because a person helped found a country, but what are the values we really want to lift up, and exemplify, and want our citizenry to emulate. I'm thinking of our current president, whether a person likes him or not. To me, there are just some character traits that are really flawed. And, so maybe this slippery slope might help us better identify values that we feel are more worthy of a country and more worthy of those whom we call leaders. I know in the city of New York, where I'm from, we still have the Christopher Columbus statue at Columbus Circle. And our governor, who's Italian American, says that he made a lot of contributions to this country. And I'm thinking, well, actually, Christopher Columbus never stepped foot on the country. So what are you talking about? So, I mean, it's this disconnect, but yeah.
And a clash between the stories that we tell ourselves. There's a massive check on the stories that we've been telling ourselves. And I think that's really been for the better. I mean, it's got to go deeper still, but I think that's been a real positive. I mean, that's the thing, digging deep on the Civil War. And I told myself going into it, I wasn't going to focus on the battles. That was not going to be the kind of book I was going to do. I was going to look at the tensions leading up to the war and the fallout from the war, the consequence and the meaning of the war. Some probably, to the chagrin of some Civil War buffs, probably. But that was my approach. And what became clear was that the central question of the war was, can we transform a settler slave society into a multiracial democracy? And that's a question that we're still wrestling with. And I think you talk about what we value. Like, that's what I value right now. Like, who are the people that we can look to in the past that are prevented us or got us closer to achieving that multiracial democracy? And you see that in the present too, like, the sorts of voting disenfranchisement tactics that we're seeing now, to say nothing of the emboldened white supremacist movement that we have right now. But yeah, I think that framework of that unrealized transition to a full transition to a multiracial democracy, I think is the thing that we're still wrestling with, because it's the thing that we were wrestling with at the founding of the country when Europeans first arrived here. So,
absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Connor. Let's get to some of these questions. We're right around 7:35, I believe. So the first one is from John. Your thoughts on your studies / research and the United Daughters of the Confederacy, its promotion of the lost cause, and its role in the revisionist history of the Confederacy and its leaders, including the monuments.
Oh yeah, I mean the UDC was pivotal, and before them, the predecessor to them, the Ladies Memorial Association, also hugely influential. In fact, Confederate Memorial Circle, this section of that cemetery in Selma, was the project of the Ladies Memorial Association, what would go on to become the United Daughters of the Confederacy, that chapter in Selma. And in fact, the organizer of that was Elodie Todd Dawson, who is Mary Todd Lincoln's half sister. She married this lawyer from Alabama, a secessionist, and got heavily involved in this promoting the lost cause mythology after the war. And again, to this question about looking at how fundamental protecting a slave society was to the Confederates, that becomes really tricky in how you, after the war, and how you memorialize it. 750,000 people died. And it's harder to say in public, oh, well, they died because we wanted to keep our slaves, the men and women we were enslaving. And so what you see is, and this is a project led by the UDC, to make the Southern soldier heroic, to talk about the war in terms of its battles, and commemorate the sacrifice and the loss. And so that's why all of these courthouse squares have these statues to the Confederate dead. It's like this massive coping mechanism. We're not going to talk about slavery. We're going to sidestep all of the thornier questions here, and only talk about our brave boys who died fighting for what we won't say, or we'll say states' rights, and we'll make sure that through textbooks, through this sort of massive collective memory campaign or public history campaign, just totally reframing what the war and its consequences were, and it proved incredibly effective. When I walked into 9th grade history class, the student teacher sat us down at the Civil War unit and said, this was a war fought about states' rights. So that's the long tail of that kind of public history work that the UDC was crucial in. So yeah, we're still reckoning with that.
Absolutely. And we have a question here from Mark. It seems that many of the staunchest defenders of monuments are poor and working class Southerners. Is it difficult to convince these folks of their quote unquote privilege?
Yeah, I think it is. Although, a lot of the folks that I talk to, have a lot of money too. Putting up a monument is not cheap. And it can be a reflection of political power, economic power. You need land, you need money, you need the political pull to get it up or keep it up. But yeah, I take Mark's point that I think there are some white Southerners, there are a lot of white Americans who sort of feel aggrieved and like, don't talk to me about privilege. I'm poor too. But I think that if you go back and you look at the origins of whiteness, there's no biological truth to whiteness, right? This is something that's been constructed. It's a political identity to arrange power and hierarchy. And so in this, in early colonial days, you can get poor whites to think that they are white, that whiteness is a thing. They have this sense of psychological superiority, and buying into that system is how the planter class holds power in those early colonial days. And that's the basic framework that we're still working with. W.B. Du Bois talks about it as the wages of whiteness. So yeah, I mean, the cell, I think, insofar as there's a cell, is like, this is, and Fred Moten talks about this too, like, this is killing you too. Like, the fact that you might not have good access to healthcare either is a function of racial capitalism. So if you want this to be better, think past race and understand that it has very real consequences, but it doesn't need to. Like, it has been invented and it can be undone too. And it involves finding common cause with other poor folks, with other oppressed folks, people who are marginalized by these systems that are meant to hoard opportunities, wealth, healthcare, houses in parts of town that aren't, ecological wastelands. So yeah, I mean, I think the idea that, like, if you can getting past that sort of psychological superiority that whiteness affords, and into an idea that nothing about how we live is inevitable and it could be better for all of us, I think is, the star to steer towards. But I mean, that's I don't mean to pretend that that's easy.
No, it's not easy at all.
But I think that's the framework that I'm thinking about it in.
Mhm. Okay, and from Jan, we have a question. What can we as individuals do to counter these racist statues and the spurious lost cause stories?
Hmm. One is, I think, just tell the truth wherever possible. The historical record is on your side in in this debate, and so I think citing that wherever possible is a good way to go. Also, I've talked a lot tonight about thinking about history in terms of its consequence on the present, and I think that might be useful here too. Like, it's wrong that's asking yourself, why is it wrong that statue is still up? What is it about something in the present that makes that statue an insult? Is it, the way we fund public schools? Is it, the way we have the voting districts are drawn, or any number of things? Like, what is the thing in the present that is leading to continued racial inequality that makes that statue a sort of, an insult to that compounds that injury? And then, directing your efforts into making those systems or policies more equitable too.
Okay. And then a question from John. What do you think we should do with Confederate monuments in the South? Time to take them all down and reconcile our country with the reality of slavery and its continuing systemic racism?
Yeah, in general, I think I'm willing to defer to the people that live in the places where those statues stand. There are things that I've seen that appeal to me personally, though. Like, I saw an image of a pedestal where a statue of Stalin used to stand in Budapest, and he's been cut off at the feet, so all you can see are his shoes, his boots, and his ankle. And there's something powerful about the kind of leaving the lingering, decimation of that statue, that appeals to me. There's a statue in Uruguay that's been, cut up and sort of pieced together in a helter-skelter sort of way that's also powerful. But yeah, I mean, in general, I think getting away from that, immortalizing an individual on a pedestal as a monument, I think is a good way to go. Generally, I think about things like the Memorial for Peace and Justice in Montgomery, what's more colloquially known as the Lynching Memorial.
Mm-hmm.
That is, instead of looking to the past to honor it, instead looking to the past to grieve it, to mourn it, to tell the truth about it, and to see how that still is with us and still shaping the present. So yeah, I think, memorials and broader, community-based public art is the way forward, I think.
Okay, and I think we're coming up on a quarter of, so we have a couple more questions. Wida asks, what cities does your book cover? What are the cities that you focus on in the book?
Yeah, sorry, Wida, I should have said that up top. So the book, forgive me, the book is in Selma, Alabama, at Murfreesboro, Tennessee, which is where the Middle Tennessee State University is, and there was a on-campus campaign to try and change the name of a building there that I covered. In Nashville, which you might have seen if you've driven on I-65, right on the shoulder of the northbound I-65 in South Nashville, is this huge and like comically grotesque and ugly statue of Forrest that I write about. It was sculpted by a man named Jack Kershaw, who led the fight against school integration in Tennessee in the 50s, represented James Earl Ray in the 70s, and co-founded the League of the South, which is a secessionist white nationalist group that was responsible for instigating violence in Charlottesville in 2017. So there's a sort of long tail of white supremacy embodied in that statue. And then the last city that I reported in is in Memphis, where there's this 30-foot bronze statue of Forrest that was removed at the end of 2017 in this very dramatic and moving late night scene where that statue was taken down. So 4 cities and 4 really interesting stories about contesting these monuments.
Excellent. And of course, we couldn't let you, address a Georgia audience without asking about Stone Mountain. So Andrea asks, any thoughts on Stone Mountain? It has been suggested that the state simply quit funding maintenance of the carving and let nature reclaim the mountain.
Oh, I hadn't heard that. I like that, though.
I hadn't heard that either, actually.
I think, the sort of withering and decay of that, I think, could be powerful. I like that better than the other proposal that I've heard, which is to put Outcasts, like a relief of Outcasts next to it. And that's not, I love Outcasts, but I just, and I think some of those recontextualizations can be interesting, but that one seems like we could let Outcasts be Outcasts and not have to, put them in that. But yeah, letting that sort of decay, I think it could be cool. There's actually a statue park outside of DC in Virginia that has these presidential statues there that have just been left and are decaying. And going there, you do feel like time is running its course on them, and you see it is powerful, like the ideas and policies that they represented sort of withering along with the stone that they're carved out of. So yeah, I'm open to that idea about Stone Mountain.
Interesting. We have 2 more questions. And Judy asks, Connor, I heard your interview with Lois Reitzes on WABE today. You said that the act of putting up statues speaks more to the people who put them up than the people who are represented in the statue. Can you talk a little about that?
Yeah, definitely. They're not, they don't get there by accident, so putting them up, like I was saying, requires money, it requires political capital, it can often require land. And so while they're seeking to honor someone from the past, they're also a reflection of the power wielded in the present, whether it's to put it up or to keep it up. City councils are deciding the fates of these statues, mayors, school administrators, they're all wielding power. And so we can see in the present a reflection of the values of the place, whether these things stay up or not. So they're about the past, but they're about, power struggles in the present too. And that's part of why it led me to want to report on them, because they were a way of thinking about the past colliding with the present in a really interesting way. And that was certainly true in all of the monuments that I write about. Obviously, this statue in Selma goes up right after the election of the first Black mayor. On campus at MTSU, that building gets named after Forrest just 4 years after the Brown v. Board decision, but 4 years before the school would actually comply with that decision. So it's like, before we're going to integrate, we're going to make sure we get Forrest's name on this hall. This ugly cartoonish statue of Forrest in Nashville goes up in the 90s, and I think you can read that as a reaction to like the New South, the changing ideas of multiculturalism, more immigrants coming to the Nashville area, settling there. Really inspired a lot of neo-Confederate groups to take a sort of harder edge, talk more openly about secession, build statues to Nathan Bedford Forrest. And of course, in Memphis, that's the oldest statue that I write about. That goes up in 1905, but that's just the same year that the city is implementing Jim Crow laws, segregating its streetcars. And it's in the aftermath of Ida B. Wells' reporting about racial terror lynchings. So in each of them, obviously they're reaching for that Confederate past, but they're reaching for it because of what's happening on the ground in the present. And I think that was the really interesting thing that I try and mine in this book, is the way that the past is constantly in conversation with the present.
Ella asks, how does religion connect with this conversation? Did churches support and or protest the statues going up, or are there religious arguments you noticed or you saw in the conversations then or today?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And it actually, it comes up a lot in Memphis. And really the sort of climax of the book, one of the most moving parts of the book for me personally, was one, I attended a Sons of Confederate Veterans meeting a couple months after the Forrest statue in Memphis came down. And in the lead up to that removal, something like 100 religious leaders in the city had co-signed a letter supporting the city's plan to remove that statue. And as you can imagine, that did not sit well with Sons of Confederate Veterans folks, to the point where at this meeting that I was at, someone got up and asked if they had a recommendation for a new church to go to because their pastor had supported the removal of this monument. And then the flip side of that was, in that same spring, the spring of 2018, a parishioner at Calvary Episcopal, in a church that's in downtown Memphis, its parking lot used to be for a slave market in Memphis. And when one of the parishioners realized that, he organized a service to commemorate and to tell the truth about that, and to commemorate the men and women who had been trafficked through that market. And that was an incredibly moving ceremony, and I think an important act of truth telling. There was a marker in there for 50 years. There'd been a marker in that parking lot, but it only said, Forrest lived here and had done some early business dealings. Early business dealings being, of course, code for
slave trading.
And so he put up a new marker that told the truth about the slave trade in the city and Forrest's role in it, and the fact that, that the parking lot of this church was once this market. And what was really interesting was that the church was around then. So the backyard of this church in the 1850s was this slave market. And the rector at the church gave this really moving speech where he was talking about, how that would have just felt incredibly natural, an everyday truth of their lives. The white parishioners of this church would have thought it wouldn't have blinked twice at it, probably. But he and I think that was an important revelation. But he pushed it further and said, and challenged the people who were there for that service to think about the things that we've grown accustomed to, that feel totally natural to us, but that are implicated in violence, inequity, the injustices that we've kind of gone blind to around us. And I feel like that's
a great analogy. That's a great analogy. Yes.
Yeah. I think that's a real call to all of us.
And then there was one other question that almost got lost in the chat section from Margaret, and this is a very appropriate way for us to wind up. Margaret asks, how has your book been received in Alabama?
It seems like it's being received well. I think. It is, writing is an incredibly lonely thing to do. The hours that you spend alone at your desk, biting your knuckle, writing, revising. So just to have it out in the world is incredible. And I have heard from people that the book has resonated with, and that is just an amazing feeling. I've heard from some folks who aren't crazy about it either. But I think that was inevitable. But the fact that it is resonating with people is really powerful. And I'm trying not to lose sight of that.
Well, as I shared with you earlier, I started reading it, and it really is a good read. It really reads well, and it's actually interesting. So I encourage those who are listening in this evening to purchase it and to read for yourselves. It's really a good book. Are there we have about 5 minutes left, maybe 4 minutes. Do you have any burning last thoughts or suggestions you might want to leave with the audience before we sign off?
I just want to thank everyone for being here. we're spending so much time looking into our computer screens these days that it really means a lot to me that you want to show up in your free time and be a part of this too. So yeah, thank you everyone. It means a lot for you to be here and to ask such thoughtful questions too. It's really great. And hopefully we can do it again soon in person.
Well, thank you so much, Connor. And thank you to the History Center, to Kate Whitman and the entire team over at the History Center for providing this opportunity. And it was really great chatting with you, Connor. I look forward to finishing your book. I got started. Now I look forward to finishing it.
Yeah, tell me what you think.
I really wish you well as you continue to get the word out about this, and maybe you might find yourself being involved in some activities today with regard to monuments and reshaping how we tell this country's story.
Yeah, here's hoping. Thanks so much, Anthony. I really appreciate you taking the time. And
oh, my pleasure.
Doing this.
Have a great evening.
You too. And thanks.
Take care, everyone. Have a great evening.